I came home that evening with a bottle of champagne under my arm, and the biggest news of my life sitting in my chest like a held breath. My grandmother had passed 6 weeks earlier, and the reading of her will had finally happened that afternoon. I'd driven home from the attorney's office in a kind of beautiful daze, the kind where the radio is playing but you don't hear it, where you stop at red lights but can't remember stopping. 31 years old, and my grandmother had left me her software company. Not the building, not a percentage. The whole thing, Hartley Digital Solutions, the firm she'd built from a spare bedroom in Tucson in 1987, now worth somewhere north of $9 million. I wanted to tell my husband first, before my sister, before my mom, before anyone. That's how marriages are supposed to work, right? You share the earthquakes with the person you sleep next to. His truck was already in the driveway when I pulled in, and there was another car parked at the curb I didn't recognize, a silver sedan. I remember thinking it belonged to one of his poker buddies. My brother-in-law was standing on the front porch, not my husband, his brother, Nathan. That was the first wrong note. Nathan was leaning against the railing with his arms crossed, and he had the look on his face that I'd seen once before, the time he'd wrecked my husband's car in college and had to be the one to break the news. That specific expression men get when they've been sent to deliver something they don't want to deliver. "Hey Mara," he said. He didn't move. I stopped at the bottom of the steps. The champagne was starting to feel heavy. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" He looked at his shoes. "You should probably go inside." My husband, Derek, was standing in our living room with his hands in his pockets. His mother was sitting in the armchair by the window, the good armchair, the one I'd reupholstered myself last spring. She was perfectly still, the way cats are still when they're watching something. There was a manila folder on the coffee table. Derek didn't say hello. He didn't ask how the reading went. He looked at me the way you look at something you've already decided to throw away, and he said, "We need to talk." My mother-in-law, Frances, reached over and slid the folder toward me without standing up. Inside were divorce papers, already filled out, already signed on his line. I stood there holding the champagne bottle and the divorce papers at the same time, and I thought, this is the strangest moment of my entire life. "The house is going on the market," Derek said. "I've already talked to an agent. You have 3 days." Frances uncrossed her ankles and recrossed them in the other direction. "It's better this way, Mara. You know it hasn't been working." I looked at her. I looked at Derek. I looked down at the papers in my hand, and then, for a reason I still can't fully explain, I smiled. Not a polite smile, not a nervous smile, a real one, the kind that starts somewhere behind your sternum and just rises up whether you want it to or not. Derek's expression shifted. "What is so funny?" "Nothing," I said. "Nothing at all. Are you seriously laughing right now?" "I'm not laughing." I set the champagne down on the entryway table, carefully. "I'm just thinking." What I was thinking was this: they had no idea. Let me back up, because the picture I just painted, shocked wife, sighted at her own front door, isn't entirely accurate. I was surprised by the timing. I was surprised that Nathan was on the porch, that Frances was already in the armchair like she owned the place, that they'd scheduled this particular Tuesday to blow up my life. But I was not surprised that it was coming. I'd known about Derek's other life for 14 months. It started with something small and stupid. A notification on his laptop that popped up while he was in the shower, and I was using it to look up a recipe. A message from someone named Kay that said "miss you already" with a heart emoji. I clicked away before I could read more, sat there with my hands in my lap for about 30 seconds. Then I opened the browser history. An hour later, I closed the laptop and went and started dinner and didn't say a word. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. I know that about myself. My instinct when I find a grenade is not to throw it immediately, it's to understand exactly what I'm holding first. So instead of screaming or crying or throwing his phone across the room, I did what I do when I need to solve a problem. I got quiet and I got systematic. Over the next few weeks, I documented everything I found. Not obsessively, I still went to work, still made dinner, still watched TV next to him on the couch like a normal person. But I paid attention. I noticed the weekends when his work trips conveniently overlapped with gaps in our joint account. I noticed the business credit card he'd gotten that I wasn't on. I started quietly photographing statements. What I found over those 14 months was worse than an affair. Derek had been siphoning money from our joint accounts into a separate account for over 2 years. Small amounts at first, 200 here, 300 there, the kind of thing that reads as a rounding error if you're not paying close attention. but it added up to just over $40,000. He'd also forged my signature on a home equity line of credit application, taking out $120,000 against our house. He'd spent most of it. I had copies of everything. I also found out about 8 months in that Frances had known, not just suspected, known. She'd helped him open the separate account. Her name was on the paperwork as a secondary contact. That's when I stopped thinking of this as a marital problem and started thinking of it as a legal one. I hired an attorney named Deborah in March of the previous year. Not a divorce attorney, a financial crimes attorney. We spent 4 months building a case before we even talked about divorce. She connected me with a forensic accountant who went through 7 years of our financial records. She helped me understand what had been done to me in terms that would matter in a courtroom. Then I waited. I know people will read that and think, why would you stay? Why would you sit at dinner with someone who is robbing you and smile and pass the bread? Here's why. Leaving before the case was airtight meant Derek and Frances could move money, destroy evidence, and deny everything with clean hands. Staying meant I got to watch. Staying meant every new transaction was another data point. Staying meant that when the day came, and I knew it would come, I just didn't know it would be a Tuesday with champagne in my hand, I would be ready. The day I found out about my grandmother's will, I'd called Deborah from the parking lot of the attorney's office. I told her what I'd inherited. She told me that timing-wise, we were ready to move. We'd talked about filing within the next 2 to 3 weeks. I hadn't expected them to file first. Derek was still staring at me like I'd grown a second head. You need to sign those papers, he said. The sooner the better. I picked the folder back up, tucked it under my arm, and looked at him very steadily. I'll have my attorney review them. You don't have an attorney. Frances made a small sound. I've had one for 11 months, that landed. I watched Frances's composure flicker for just a second before she smoothed it back down. The house, Derek said, pressing forward. It's already listed. The agent said we had a showing this weekend. That's going to be a problem, I said, because our house was not legally yours to list. He blinked. It's in both our names, it is. But you also took out a $120,000 home equity line against it using a forged power of attorney, which makes any transactions you've made against this property potentially fraudulent. I kept my voice conversational the way Deborah had coached me. Not angry, just informational. Your agent might want to know that before the weekend. The room got very quiet. Nathan, who had apparently followed us inside and was now standing in the doorway to the kitchen, looked like he wanted to be literally anywhere else on earth. Frances stood up from the armchair. You don't know what you're talking about, $42,614, I said. That's how much was transferred out of our joint account in increments of under $500 between March of 2022 and last October. Would you like me to list the dates? Her face went pale. Just slightly. Just enough. I have a meeting with the FBI Financial Crimes Field Office on Thursday, I said. I've had it scheduled for 3 weeks. My attorney filed a formal complaint in April. This isn't something I put together this week, Frances. This has been in progress for almost a year. Derek took a step toward me. Mara, don't. My voice didn't shake. I was surprised by that. I came home today to share the best news of my life with you. I was going to open that champagne. I glanced at the bottle on the table. But here we are. I walked to the front door and opened it. I'd like you both to leave. This is still my home until a court says otherwise, and I'm asking you to go. Frances opened her mouth. Frances, I met her eyes. Go. The next 72 hours were a controlled kind of chaos that I experienced mostly from my home office, on the phone with Deborah. The FBI meeting on Thursday went forward as scheduled. I brought my forensic accountant's report, 14 months of documentation, and a flash drive containing every photograph I'd taken of statements and correspondence. The 2 agents I met with, a woman named Agent Torres and her partner, were professional and thorough. They asked questions for nearly 3 hours. By Friday afternoon, they had executed a search warrant on Derek's separate bank account. Derek called me 17 times between Thursday evening and Saturday morning. I didn't pick up. His brother texted me, "Please just talk to him." I replied, "Have him speak to my attorney." Frances, I later learned, had hired her own lawyer by Friday morning. She was not prepared for what that lawyer told her. Here is what Derek and Frances had not accounted for: my grandmother's company. Hartley Digital Solutions had been partly founded on a patent my grandmother had filed jointly with a business partner in 1989. That partner had passed away a decade ago, and his estate had quietly tried to contest my grandmother's sole ownership of the patent for years. My grandmother's attorney had handled it, but the case had never fully gone away. What Derek had apparently been telling his girlfriend, I learned this later from messages the FBI surfaced during the investigation, was that once he divorced me, my inheritance would be subject to equitable distribution, that my grandmother's company was a marital asset because it had come to me during our marriage. He was wrong. I had spoken with 3 separate attorneys about this in the months before the reading of the will. Because my grandmother had told me, quietly, about 2 years before she passed, that she intended to leave me the company, and I had been very careful to document that we had no marital commingling of that asset. It had never been discussed in our household, never incorporated into any joint financial planning, never referenced in any document Derek had signed. It was mine, clean and separate. The girlfriend had apparently been very excited about $9 million. She'd been even more excited about being the one Derek chose after he got rid of his wife. She was less excited about the FBI investigation. I know this because she was interviewed as a witness, and the investigation files, portions of which I was able to access later through my attorney, noted that she had cooperated fully and distanced herself from Derek almost immediately. There's something almost funny about that if you're in the right headspace for it. The court date that mattered most wasn't the divorce hearing. It was the civil proceeding where the judge ruled on the financial fraud. Derek's attorney had spent 6 months arguing that the transfers were joint marital decisions that I had agreed to informally, that the home equity loan was a misunderstanding, that the paperwork irregularities were clerical errors. My attorney played recordings. I had not known, when I started documenting everything, that Arizona is a one-party consent state for recordings. Deborah told me that in our second meeting, very matter-of-factly, and suggested I keep my phone's voice recorder running during certain conversations at home. I had not abused this. I wasn't recording every dinner or every argument about the dishwasher. But I had, on 3 specific occasions over 14 months, recorded conversations in which Derek explicitly referenced the transfers, explicitly stated they were going into an account I wasn't on, and explicitly discussed the home equity funds in ways that made clear I had not consented. In one of them, Frances was present. In that recording, she referred to me by a name I won't repeat here, and said, and I am paraphrasing only slightly, "She'll never figure it out. She doesn't pay attention to money." That recording played in a federal courtroom in Phoenix on a Wednesday afternoon in March. The judge's face did not change, but the silence in the room afterward was the loudest sound I have ever heard. Frances's attorney had made a tactical error in the early filings. She had argued that Frances was not a financial participant in the scheme, only a supportive family member who had offered emotional guidance to her son. That position collapsed entirely once the federal investigators produced the account-opening documents with Frances's signature and the series of emails between her and Derek discussing the transfers by name, by amount, and by date. Frances was charged with conspiracy to commit financial fraud and obstruction of justice for her attempts after our living room confrontation to delete and overwrite files on a laptop she'd given Derek the previous Christmas. The laptop deletion was discovered when the FBI imaged Derek's devices. You can delete files. You cannot, as it turns out, delete metadata. She pled no contest 6 months after the charges were filed. The plea deal required full restitution, a fine, and 3 years of supervised probation. She also lost her real estate license. She had been a licensed agent in Arizona for 20 years, and the fraud charges triggered an automatic review by the state board. I learned about the license revocation from a text message from Nathan, of all people, who had by that point apologized to me twice in writing and once in person. I don't know what to do with Nathan as a chapter in this story. He wasn't involved, and he seemed genuinely devastated. I don't carry anything toward him, I just don't know him well enough to keep him. Derek's case went to trial because he would not take the plea deal his attorney was recommending. His attorney was recommending a plea deal because the evidence against him was substantial, and the recordings were, as Deborah put it during our prep session with characteristic dryness, not great for Derek. He was convicted on 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to 30 months, with eligibility for early release after 20. He is, as of the time I'm writing this, approximately 14 months into that sentence. The divorce was finalized 8 months ago. There were no joint assets left to dispute. The home equity debt had been applied against Derek's liability in the fraud case. The house itself had been court-ordered to be sold with proceeds split in a way that reflected the fraudulent lien, and Derek's own accounts were largely frozen pending restitution. I walked out of my marriage with less money than I'd walked in with, on paper. Off paper, I walked out with Hartley Digital Solutions. I want to be honest about the parts that don't make for a clean ending. Running my grandmother's company is harder than I expected. She built it over 40 years. I've been running it for less than one. I have a CEO, Mel, who has been with the company for 16 years, and who knows more about our client relationships than I will for probably another decade. I lean on her heavily. I am learning to be okay with that. There are days when I sit at my grandmother's desk. It's still her desk, I haven't replaced it. And I think about the version of this story where I came home that Tuesday, and there was no champagne and no divorce papers and no silver sedan at the curb. Where nothing happened and Derek and I just kept being what we were. I spent 3 years of my marriage not knowing what he was doing. 3 years of dinners and Christmases and a vacation to Sedona, where we hiked Bell Rock and took photos that are still on my phone. I don't look at those photos often. I've also learned some things about myself that are harder to sit with than the story I've been telling. I was good at the strategy. I was good at the documentation and the patience and the building of the case. But I was bad, genuinely bad, at asking for help during that 14 months. My sister knew something was wrong and I shut her out. My closest friend, Phoebe, kept asking if everything was okay and I kept saying yes because I didn't want to involve anyone before I was sure of what I was dealing with. That was protective in a legal sense and probably damaging in a human sense. I'm working on that. Slowly. The company crossed $11 million in valuation last quarter. That's not because of anything I did. Mel and the team had a contract renewal with a healthcare network that had been in negotiation for 2 years before I arrived. But I was in the room for the final close, and I understood what was being agreed to, and I shook the right hands, and my grandmother would have been pleased. She was a woman who believed very firmly that the best revenge is building something. She used to say that the people who try to take from you are betting that you don't have anything left to build with. She said that's almost always wrong. I think about that on the days when the desk feels too big. I came home that Tuesday with champagne and the best news of my life, and my husband and his mother were waiting to tell me I had nothing. That my home was gone, that my marriage was over, that I should take the papers and sign them and disappear quietly. I smiled, not because I had a plan, not because I wasn't hurt. I was, in ways that still surface when I'm not expecting them. I smiled because 14 months earlier, I had decided that whatever happened next was going to be on my terms. Not his, not Francis's. Mine. The house sold. The company is mine. Francis is on probation. Derek is serving his sentence. And I have, sitting on the corner of my grandmother's desk, an unopened bottle of champagne. I'm waiting for the right moment. I think it's coming soon.